Welcome to a podcast about the adventures of a divorced entrepreneurial father. Now, this is a hub of stories, cautionary tales, and life lessons behind the daily struggle to do better and be better and ultimately to find new sparks in life. And even if no one listens to any of these episodes, but I leave something behind for my children that sparks something in or even for them, well, that's good enough for me. However, if you do like what you hear on SparkHub, please support us by linking to the show notes below each episode. And once you're there, please consider subscribing to this podcast on the platform of your choice. And for the best experience, our newsletter gives you the inside scoop, exclusive content, and advanced previews of what's coming next. And by the way, your data is always private with us. We don't sell it, and you can unsubscribe from all of that at any time you want without judgment. So let's begin. My name is Alan, and I have a heck of a story for you. Welcome back to the SparkHub podcast. This is the first episode for 2026, and there is a lot going on, which I will get into, but you would be right to notice that the title of this episode might be misleading. It says Save the Marriage. If you've listened to any previous podcasts, you know that I am divorced and soon to be moving into my own house, so my marriage wasn't saved. Come back to that in a minute. This is also a first for me and for SparkHub, in that it is a guest that I didn't know. So I'll explain. So far, in all the episodes I've recorded, I've either done them solo, just myself, or I've invited guests on to be part of the discussion. But every guest that you've seen so far, and every episode I've done so far, is somebody I know, and somebody who's contextual and relevant to the topic of discussion. But I did an episode with a friend of mine named Rich, where we discussed how you can be successful in divorce and blended families if you play your cards right. And very much my guiding principle has always been my family comes first and cohesion comes first. And Rich posted that episode up on LinkedIn, and then within days I got all kinds of people reaching out to me asking if they could come on my podcast. I responded to everyone, but pretty much everyone, it seemed to me, was either an AI bot or some kind of, I suppose, CRM trigger. So they may or may not have been real people, or they may have been real people with a sales team or a research team, I don't know. But one in particular, a guy named Lee, was consistent in responding to me, and he runs something called Save the Marriage. So I won't go into too much detail except to say I had a fascinating discussion with Lee, which you're about to hear, and he revealed so much wisdom that he'd gained over 25 years of being a coach, a marriage coach, and helping people either save their marriages or, which is interesting, even if they get divorced, planting seeds for better cohesion in the future and a better relationship with certain frameworks and ways of thinking. And hate to say this, he is American and they like their slogan, so he's got a 3-letter system and a simple way of looking at things in complex ways. But that being said, sometimes that's the best way to do it. Just boil it down to simple things. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation, my first ever guest that I didn't know until now, my conversation with Lee. Enjoy. So hi Lee, welcome to the SparkHub, and I have to start by saying you are the first guest on this podcast that I don't know.
I'm the stranger.
Yeah, you're the cold call. But I think what's interesting, and just before we get to why you came here, is I'm obviously doing this a little bit to rediscover my voice, a little bit of therapy. But I fundamentally want SparkHub to be a place where people get inspiration and sparks, as it were, and then they find a hub where they can find more. And that's always been the construct. And so I suppose where to start would be, you approached me, you heard the podcast, and you wanted to chat about it. So where are you based and what exactly do you do?
So I am in the States. I'm on the East Coast in North Carolina. But for 25 years, it hasn't mattered. I've been on the internet working with people around the world who want to see if they can save their marriage. And that is kind of an important thing. I always think that marriages have the potential to see where it can go, not the potential to be saved, right? But to work on things. And so my interest is always, kind of twofold. Entrepreneurial for sure, because I watch entrepreneurs step into relational issues on a regular basis. And we can talk about why that often is the case. It's not 100%, but often the case. And two, I was trained as a therapist who went to coaching because I think that there are some skills that we all need to understand about relationships, period, that help us to navigate even future relationships. So a lot of times people say, man, I wish that I had read your material before I got married. And my response is, you wouldn't have taken it in. we often don't take things in until we're in a crisis. So
You weren't ready. You
that's
weren't
kind of,
ready. I get it. Yeah, you weren't ready.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. So that's,
how did you get into this line of work? I mean, 25 years you've been in the game, but like, what was the spark that got you into this line of work?
yeah, the spark is a sad spark, right? I watched what happened in my extended family. I come from, my parents are still happily married in their 80s, and my grandparents were too. But I had an uncle went through 5 or 6, I'm not sure, divorces, 6 or 7 marriages. Yeah, so he set the stage where none of us have to worry about it because of the average, right? We're all safe from the average because of his contribution to that. And then I had 2 aunts that were unsuccessful in their relationships for the most part. And I watched the devastation that did on multiple levels because of how they handled it, not because completely of the divorce, but because of what they didn't understand about the impact. So I have cousins that have disappeared from the family because of how it imploded or exploded. And that kind of set the stage for me when I decided to do work in helping people as a therapist and now as a coach, to wanting to see what could be done to either save a relationship or help preserve whatever relationship has to follow through. So in your case, co-parenting, because the dynamics are still there.
Wow. I mean, I have so much to say about that, but do you feel that because, well, first of all, interesting that your uncle skewed the bell curve in your family. And just to add numbers, my parents are in their 80s and they're still together. My ex's parents are, I think, in their 70s and mid 70s and still together. So from both our sides, we came from, marriages that have lasted. And within my family, I don't think it's been more than one or two. So my batting average or my bell curve is probably a lot flatter than yours, clearly. But if I understood you correctly, what sparked it, aside from mathematical anomaly, was the fact that you felt you could do something. Was it a bit of a, I'm trying to think of what the word is, but you felt like you could make a difference, and then it became your calling because of what you'd witnessed?
Well, so I think most people who are in the therapy or coaching world realize that they were doing that stuff long before they chose the profession. I,
Yeah.
in my life, had people always coming to me sharing their problems. And, as a teenager, I was not the popular guy. I was the good friend that everybody confided in. And that was
You were
kind
the
of set
safe
the
rock. You
stage.
were the safe rock in the, yeah.
I was, yeah, that's one way to put it. I was not the popular kid. I was the one that they confided in. And so I realized that that was just my natural inclination. So I knew I wanted to do something in the helping world. I actually went to college to be in the business school, and that lasted probably a month before I went, I think I want to do the helping thing. Oddly enough, I've ended up back in the business thing with my own stuff, but I didn't see that. And so that was the kind of the beginning point. You realize your gift at some point and you go, okay, well, that's what I'm going to do.
Okay, well, I'm going to take advantage of that now. So I'm going to take advantage of your 25 years because I started this podcast and there's like a holy trinity, and I want to talk across each of these. So I'm a father. My kids are, at the moment we record this, 13 and 10. I'm divorced and finally leaving the house that we live in because we've been living together for 19 months as a divorced couple. And I'm an entrepreneur, meaning I don't work for anyone. I run my own businesses. I run my own consultancy. So those are the three, I guess, hot topics that I started the podcast for. And I kind of wanted to start maybe with, I don't know which one to start with. Let's get to co-parenting last. But what can you tell me about my profile in terms of someone who's an entrepreneur, married, now divorced? What have you noticed about my type of person? Are we rare? Are we typical? Are we atypical? I mean, I asked that question openly because I don't know how many people listening are entrepreneurs or regular workers or whatever, but across the board, I'm seeing divorces in my circle. And I don't know if I'm suddenly more sensitive to it. Maybe, if I count on hands, I could count maybe on one hand how many people are still married. Now, I say married, I don't say happily married because I don't know, but I'm surrounded by people, women and men, that have just gone through divorces. And I just wonder, from your standpoint, as someone who does this for a living, have you noticed any statistical trends in the past few years? And I would add in, especially around the COVID times, because I have my own theories, but I'd rather not make stuff up. Like, what have you noticed about divorce rates and entrepreneurial rates? And then co-parenting, we'll get to in a minute.
Yeah, so entrepreneurs, by statistics, have a higher than average divorce rate. There are some professions that do, and interesting, it's usually doctors, attorneys, ministers, and entrepreneurs that are at this higher level of divorce, believe it or not. And I think it is because of how encompassing those careers can be and taking your energy, getting your focus, and also your passion. Entrepreneurs tend to be in love with ideas of what they're creating. They have maybe a baby, but maybe a mistress in their what they're dealing with, this business. And that does pull away energy. Entrepreneurs tend to be happiest when they are invested in that project. And we only have so much energy. And so if it's going there, it's often not going there. So if it's going to the business, it's often not going to the relationship. Take it a step further, entrepreneurs tend to share some traits of believing, whether they will admit it or not, believing that they're right. Otherwise, you wouldn't take the risk you take, right? I mean, there has to be some confidence in your viewpoint, an optimistic confidence that you can overcome. So we know the rates of divorce. We also know the rates of business failure.
Yes.
And yet every day people step up to get married and think they've already beat the odds. And people start businesses, entrepreneurs start businesses thinking they'll beat the odds. And there are some commonalities to that little fact that you believe in yourself enough to do those things, believe in the relationship enough to do those things that can sometimes unwind on people in ways they don't see coming. So my son was telling me about a company he was connected to, and I said, you watch, it's going to crash and burn, because the CEO was also the founder, and he would not turn back from his idea of how it should go. And his idea of how it should go was about 5 years behind where things were. And sure enough, because he couldn't get out of his own way, that company crashed. Same thing happens in relationships. People can't get out of their own way and say, hey, you know what? Maybe I don't know the way to do this. Maybe I need to get some perspective on this. And by the time they figure that out, they've often done so much damage that it's a big recovery curve.
Wow. Interestingly, I started when I was 17 or 18. My first career was in policing. Did 3 years in law enforcement. And I looked then at how many marriages were crashing because of shift work and danger and all the stuff that's associated with that. And I thought,
Yep.
This is not for me.
Another group that has, they've got an elevated, Yep.
But you understand why, the hours, the unpredictability, the danger, the stress, the adrenaline. So anyway, that was my younger years. And then I moved on. I went to business school. I worked in ski resorts, and I made my way to Australia for a while, started some businesses. And then, cut a long story short, I ended up in the UK. And then I was in marketing for the longest time. But that wasn't steady. Marketing world isn't steady because, like you say, there's a lot of leaders that don't get out of their own way, and then they follow the wrong trends. And even if you are the best earner in the business, if the business loses a key client and a key revenue stream, then the whole team can go. And so in the early years of my marriage and having children, that was my world, is production and long days and clients that were fickle and trying to book revenue. And I mean, it was just, and I just said to myself at the time, why am I using my time and talent to make other people rich? Why don't I apply it to myself? So everything you just said about optimism and belief was true. The only thing I would say is different in my journey was when I became an entrepreneur, I was around a lot more for school pickups, for domestic tasks. So I could sort of structure my day around my kids. And my ex had stayed home after having our first child, and she'd given up a career that she loved. And I always made her a promise, don't worry, we'll get you something better. And I went out and represented her and made her part of a company, and sort of was trying to run a relationship to make her happy and give her a fulfilling career while she was home with young children. But I was around. I was, and again, I'm not one to complain. I was running businesses, starting businesses, doing laundry, doing dishes, changing diapers, but all of that was a lot. And as you say, the bandwidth to cover all of that and still stay positive was tough. And just when things were getting good, we all got locked up.
Yeah.
And my youngest son was 4, and my oldest was 7. And suddenly we were cooped up for 2 weeks, and we're doing an audio podcast, but I'm doing commas in the air. Like, we were supposed to stay inside for 2 weeks, and that turned into 2 years.
Yeah.
Every part of the world had a different philosophy on everything from vaccines to masks to schools opening to whatever. And I was talking to Swedish colleagues who had no life interrupted, and I was speaking to Americans in different states that were either locking down or loading guns. So I look at those 2 years and I go, okay, like, I feel that up until 2023, all told, I had been successful in many ways, or at least I perceived to be successful. And what I mean by that, I'm not saying I need money or I need status or a title. I was just successful in that everything was balanced. And while my kids were young, I was around a lot, which most fathers don't get to do. But then I think when your home becomes a prison, it becomes your workplace, it becomes your school for your kids, it becomes, you're all competing for internet bandwidth. Like it's cabin fever. You're allowed one walk a day. All of the stuff that we went through, I feel had a massive impact. And to not to speak on behalf of others, but my ex had to suspend a lot of her plans that we were making to launch businesses, to travel, to do all the stuff we've been waiting to do because we've been so occupied with young kids. That got taken away. And I think those years, you're never going to get them back. And then all these years later, sitting here divorced, businesses are still going well, but the timeline, thought it would be 3 years, turned into 6 years, turned into 8 years. And now I'm not a coach like you, but I'm a consultant. And very often people come to me to help do business transformation projects. And the first thing I do is say, give me your worst case scenario in terms of time, revenue, goals, multiply it by 3. If you think you can last that long, you might have a business after that length of time, because that's how long it's going to take. And most people say no. And to your point, I suppose I was perceived to be not present, because even though I'm home with my kids and trying to play, I'm still checking messages coming in, and has that money come in, and has that book, has that guy done his job? And I don't think we're designed to do that. So I guess I wonder, obviously you've outlined the profile of an entrepreneur, and I'd say I kind of fit that, but with caveats. But what about everyone else? Did they get affected in the same way in your experience for those COVID years where everyone had to suddenly be stuck?
Yeah, I saw, I don't want to reduce it just to this, but one of the effects of COVID was that it amplified. And so families who, I'm not going to say flourished, but families who kind of felt like they were hunkering down together and found a way to relationships so that it amplified their connection. If there were fractures, it amplified the fractures, and it sure stressed, so business world knows anti-fragile. It was certainly a test of the anti-fragile nature of relationships and families and communities and businesses for sure. So the amplification was what I saw. I had people who suddenly were like, okay, how are we going to not be together, stuck in the same house, because we can't move at this point? And then I had people going, well, we're stuck together. Let's see if we can make this better, because it had amplified the fact that there were fractures there. And I had both that were happening, people coming to me for both of those. For my family, my adult kids were home in ways that obviously I would never have chosen, but I treasure, because we never thought we would have them living with us at that point in their life. And we hunkered down and, had as good a time as you can have when you are in lockdown. I watched other families that it was like kind of the pressure building. When you do an atomic bomb, you have to first compress before it explodes. And this was a compression point. And then it explodes. And so both were happening depending on what was being amplified. So lots of damage done for sure, and on many levels. And then there were the pieces of relationships that were able to be linked more closely. So there's some creative things that came out of it. I mean, both my kids can now work remotely in a way that never would have been true before COVID. There are opportunities that were there. It's just that there was such trauma, still trauma attached to that. And I see that in the polarization that is true in lots of different countries now. That polarization is just an amplification. Wherever you were, amplifies out to further stress, and kind of revealed something about what happens when we are placed in situations that we have no control over, which, by the way, is actually true all the time. We just don't have to look at it all the time. And so it puts something in our face that we aren't used to facing on a day-to-day basis.
So it was like a big magnifying glass. And I certainly felt that. And interestingly, one of the guests I had on recently, who was someone I met long ago during the journey to meet who would become my wife in Australia and became a friend. I lost touch, we got back in touch, and she's in Australia. And if you listen to that podcast, she'll tell you that she's been living with her ex for 5 years. And then I read an article here in the UK that says there's a ton of couples now that are separate, be they divorced or partnerships that have dissolved, or whatever phrase you want to use, but they can't move out. They have to become roommates because there is now a cost of living crisis. I can't speak for the US, but the UK is certainly in a recession. There's the costs have gone up, the income's gone down. And I think finance is a big part of it, because if one partner is the provider and one partner is the carer, but over time they want to flip roles or they want to equalize roles, there's the pressure of not only what we went through in COVID, but then there's the pressure of the roles, female and male, and then there's identity and all of that. And then there's social media, as you say, and this is what I've noticed, is I get into arguments with friends of mine who I thought were the same, I don't know, mindset as me, but they've been served a completely different news feed, often using the same
Mhm.
images and the same thing, but with just different titles. And we have completely disparate views of reality now. And now it's even with AI coming in, you kind of go, well, wait, what is reality? And suddenly
Yeah.
all of this is compounding in my view. And then you got two kids at home that are, that are still young, and you're trying to help, but I think my biggest regret is my kids think you have to work from home. And I'm trying to tell them, I mean, I come into London 1 day a week and I'm home for the rest, managing my teams remotely, but that's not normal. There's no water cooler moments anymore. There's no serendipity. There's no brainstorms, or not. I'm just saying, not that there isn't, but there's certainly a lot less of it. And my kids were at the age, it sounds like yours were grown up, but mine were the age were like, oh, this is normal. I can just bang on daddy's door when he's on a Zoom call and ask him to play a game. It's just like, I think that the whole set that they witnessed during those times was wrong. And then it was amplified by all the things that have happened after. So here we are in 2026 with all of that going on, all the conflicts in the world. And it just feels to me like the world's in a pressure cooker a lot of the time. So then how do you have the bandwidth to deal with geopolitics, aging parents? And my parents are in a different country. So I've got the Atlantic between us and I worry about them. I got my kids I'm worrying about. I got my ex, who, even though we're divorced, I still worry about and want to ensure that, she doesn't fall between the cracks. But I just don't know if there's a precedent for this. And so I look to someone like you. And I suppose where I'm going with all this is, like, at what point does anybody suddenly go, I need to speak to Lee or someone like Lee because I'm cracking up here and I just need help? Like, at what point do people come to you? And by the time they come to you, as you say, is it salvageable? And salvage might mean you can save the marriage, or it might mean you're going to break up, but let's make it successful for both parties. Or it could be someone like me who's looking backwards going, what the hell just happened?
Yeah. Well, and a combination for you, right? Because if you have kids, yeah, you can be divorced, but you can't get rid of each other. You have an ongoing connection, and whether that's going to be a functional connection or not is the question. So that question of relationship and the dynamics that were in the relationship are still there. Let's back up a minute and I'll tell you quickly what I think gets us to this point. So when you fall in love, you think, okay, we've got this relationship. We got it. And that's why people decide to get married, because they think their love will take them through. You have to believe that. You have to have that confidence to, to do this. Just like starting a business is based in, I've got this idea and it will work. You have to have that feeling. So that parallel is there. You fall in love, you say, yeah, we're going to spend the rest of our lives together. That's generally what happens when you get married, till death do us part. And so then you have to go, okay, now back to life. And whether that's back to, now it's time to have kids, now it's time to work, now, whatever it is, there are these pieces in our mind of, we've spent all this time building our relationship. We got that. Now we've got to go, okay, how do we go to life? And so I call it the pause button. In a marriage, you hit the pause button, and you don't consciously choose to do that. It's just that there is just so much that has to be done. And you say, okay, pause, we'll come back to us. And sometimes it's both people doing that, kind of going, we'll get back to us. Sometimes it's one person going, hey, as soon as I get this taken care of, then I know I'll come back to this. But it happens for couples. And so they go to being parents, they go to being, their job, their career, their business, whatever it is. And, when I get to this point, it'll be great. When I get to the company to the point where I can sell it, then, we can coast or whatever it is, we get to this point. Sometimes it's aging parents. I got to take care of that. Then we'll get back to us. And the problem is you can't pause a relationship. And the only one relationship where that is super magnified is in a marriage. I have friends that I always thought I'd be friends with, but we paused the relationship for whatever reason, and moved it away, got out of touch, whatever it is. And those friendships fade off. It's just not a threat to anything, though. I mean, to anything of day-to-day life. I can always think back and go, well, man, I really enjoyed that friendship. Maybe I miss them, but it's different when you are in this relationship where you're like, we're supposed to be our number one people. We're supposed to be
Yeah,
connected.
there's a home base, right? There's a home base
That's
that
the home
goes from
base.
that.
Yeah, yeah. And so you pause it, and what you're doing at that point is pausing the connection. And when you pause the connection, it doesn't go into suspended animation. You know, I always imagine these sci-fi movies where they put the people in the pods, the people go to sleep, they fly away to some distant place, wake them up, and they just are like, oh, here I am, you know, just stepping out. And that's kind of what I think people think, that we get to this point and we'll turn back to us. And so while there can be some relating, it's often the routines and the day to day and not the us. And so we go through the motions. We do take care of the kids and do the kids' stuff and do the meals and everything. But the real meat of connection, that is what got the relationship to the point where you said, I'm in it for life, has been paused and therefore begins to recede. And at some point, one person often will say, all right, this isn't good. This hurts. And they're the one who will say, I love you, but I'm not in love with you, or I'm kind of done with this, or I think we need to, you know, some people say something's got to change or I'm out. That's kind of the best case scenario. A lot of times it's the I'm out. I this can't go on.
Well, it's past the point of no return if you pause for too long. Or that's interesting. I
Yeah.
was reading somewhere else. It was a psychologist who I think is in the same line of work as you, and they said they can assess a married couple and their recoverability on a couple of metrics. And one of them was, what is the ratio of negative to positive interactions per day? And if it's above 5 to 1, then you go into this red zone, which is called contempt. And as soon as you are contemptuous of your partner, it is literally like there is no coming back from that. But if you're on the brink of that and they're still like, you say, okay, look, let's make some changes or whatever, let's have another kid. Some people say they're all band-aid solutions. And so I think from my perspective, you know, with hindsight, the way I've been talking about what I went through is, I used to be a photographer and I used to have to change lenses on a camera. And I always said there's three lenses in a marriage. There's an emotional lens, which is as wide as you can imagine, and it covers a huge amount. Then there's a financial lens, which is a macro lens. Is this much money in the bank account? And our bills are this. It's pretty binary. And then there's a zoom lens, which is the legal lens, which kind of zooms in and out, but generally has to focus on facts. And so when you bring together three lenses, you can't shoot a clear photo, is the way I've always presented it. And going through my divorce, which I would describe as amicable. You know, we both sat down and said, look, let's not put 10, 15, 20, 80 grand out the door onto lawyers. Let's just figure this out. And we did it. I thought we did it in a way that everything was clear. But now in hindsight, I realized that I put a huge value on family cohesion. I said, you know what, money will come and go, businesses will come and go. But if we can remain friends and we can remain civil and have a relationship with other members of the family, then I think the kids will benefit, and then everything else is sort of secondary. I have other couples that fight over assets and spend 50 grand with lawyers to get a 5 grand asset, and it doesn't make sense to me. But as you probably know, that's not about the asset, it's about revenge or other things. So I look back at what we did and I said, okay, you know what, we hit that objective. At least we stayed friendly. We didn't know we were going to be stuck together for 19 months. We've had 2 last Christmases, but this one's the real one. We've just had it. It's done now, because in 3 weeks we're out. Then what does Christmas look like? And so I'm saying all this because if I look back on my steps, a lot of what you said about the entrepreneurial stuff is true, bar I also wanted to make my ex happy and give her platforms to build businesses and do stuff. But when you have 2 entrepreneurs trying to do stuff, plus manage kids, plus manage everything else, that was tough. And then when it came time to sit down and do the practical steps, once you get over the emotional stuff, which you don't, you're trying to do finance and things don't make sense because you got a limited company and you're both directors and you're both shareholders. But wait, how much is that? And there's all misunderstandings about revenue and income and dividends. And like, you try to be clever about it and open about it, but it all gets misunderstood. And then you suddenly get to the legal aspects where you got to write a binding contract against circumstances that keep changing. And I always say in business, when you sign a term sheet or a contract or scope of work or anything, you put it away and you never look at it again until there's a problem. And then you pull it out and go, what did we agree again? But in my case, we were stuck together for 19 months. 19 months is 2 years of change in the children in terms of their age and their stage. One of them is now about to go to high school. One of them's been in high school, but homeschooled. Then finances have changed. Mortgages have flipped. Variable rates have changed. The food is now 3 times as much. And then you suddenly get coming out the other side and finally doing it. Well, wait, what did we agree again? but wait, that clause competes with that clause, and that clause competes with that clause, and that clause doesn't line up. So I'm at that stage now where I'm 3 weeks away from finally moving on to a new house, a custody arrangement. But I tell you what, I'm scared because now we're going to get into co-parenting. How the hell does that work? Again, my guiding principle is how can we make it work? But I suppose the worry I have now is if the guiding principle is family cohesion, we can be friends, we have dinners together, joint birthday parties, we still spend Christmas together, maybe take a holiday once in a while together. What about new partners? What about money? That changes. What about this, that, the other thing? And suddenly you're back to like, wait, what are the standards here? What's the court standard? The court standard is best interest of the children. Okay, well, how do you interpret that emotionally, financially, legally? And you start to get into this world again where my concern is the guiding principle is going to get broken just because there's just too many moving parts. Mm-hmm. And so I suppose I'm at the stage now, having listened to everything you've said and all the things I could have probably done better, but didn't. I'm at the stage now where I'm heading into co-parenting from two houses. And then all that can of worms gets opened up again, but in different ways. And I suppose, what do you think? I guess, I don't know, I know you get paid for this, so, I appreciate you maybe spitting some nickels for free, but what is your advice to someone in my position who is still an entrepreneur, who still has to hustle every day, but also wants to have time with his children, also wants to be friends with his ex, also wants the in-laws to still be cohesive? Is there any guiding light you can shine on the things that should be aligned?
So you use the word but, and I would just say that's an and. You are an entrepreneur and you want the best for the kids and you want to figure out what to do with the in-laws, and those are all ands. And because that divvies up, that so how am I going to do that? You talked about guiding principles. What are the things that we can agree on? One of the problems with co-parenting when it becomes a problem, and there are plenty of couples that just fizzle out, and so there's not really any major hurt, it's like they just kind of folded apart. But for most couples, there is somebody or both who go, yeah, there's still some hurts to that. There's still some pains, and I've got to work through that. I've got to find some way of not getting pulled into that. So the same dynamics that got a marriage into trouble can linger into co-parenting if you don't identify those and you don't say, how do we want to make sure that doesn't infect this relationship? You've used the term friends a couple of times with your ex, and I suggest that for most people, what they can look towards is being friendly. They can choose to be friendly. It's very hard to actually be friends with the ex because of those deeper disconnections that go on. Most relationships have a very hard time pairing back to a prior stage. It's just true.
When you hit the pause button, you're holding that person to account pre-pause. And yet there's a lot that's changed.
Yeah. Well, and the change of how do we then rewire our lives? I do think that commitment we make in a marriage affects us psychologically. So when it doesn't hold, there is a psychological cost that we're often struggling with of some regret might be there, some hurt, and hurt is the prelude to anger. So there's often some hurt that comes out in anger. You think you're hurt, and they're feeling it as anger. So there's a lot of the processing of those emotions that if you don't get to the place where you can say, I'm going to forgive the other person and forgive myself, I'm going to be accountable and make apologies where I need to, and then move forward, then the co-parenting can still have the dynamics that got the relationship into trouble as an undercurrent.
And that imbues itself on the children psychologically, doesn't it? It's the perception of I guess, conflict resolution. I think what you said something very interesting, which sparked a thought in my head, two thoughts actually. I've always been a big fan of Nelson Mandela, the South African president. If you know his story, in brief, he was in prison for 27 years for fighting for rights, apartheid Africa. When he got out and became president, he brought truth and reconciliation as a concept to Africa. And that's been used in North America with indigenous people and all that kind of stuff. And it is literally opening the wounds in front of each other with the trust that there can be reconciliation. It was used slightly in the World War II with Nazi Germans who suddenly said, wait, why did I do that? How could I have committed those crimes? And so I use that as a concept. And I've always kept saying to my ex at the time, like, hey, let's do truth and reconciliation. Like, even if we don't stay together, it might be a way to build a trust again, or I wish you well, or be amicable. But if one party is open to that, but the other isn't, you can't bring a horse to water and force it to drink. And so I guess my concern going into this is there's a term I learned recently, which I thought was interesting, is that there are two types of people. There are people that are quick to blame and slow to credit. And there are people that are, I guess, the opposite, credit everything and don't blame anyone. And so there's these two polar extremes of people. And I think what I'm finding now is, and I'm not saying I'm perfect or my ex is perfect or anyone's perfect, but on that spectrum, there's still things that I think are falling into the uncredited category, and there's still things that are falling into the blame category that what I would consider trivial and she might consider big, or vice versa. So I'm trying to navigate this concept of truth and reconciliation with someone who's not interested, number one, even if it is to put in place a friendship layer for the kids. And then there's that culture of, again, revisionist history. What did I miss? What, like you said, what are the signals I missed? I had my bandwidth was taken. I missed the microaggressions, or I will take accountability for all of that. The trouble is, at some point you have to stop apologizing, I think, and someone else has to willingly participate. So my hope is that if I remain channel open, hand open, honest, and above all else, the guiding principle being, I don't wish anyone ill and I want the kids to succeed. It's hard to hold that position sometimes. And as you say, have the integrity to do it when anything can trigger you, or there might just be something that happens that's innocuous, but it opens up the wound unknowingly. I say all that not to seek an answer, but I feel that everything you've said to me is like, you've got all that to navigate, is basically the message. And you have to decide what level of integrity you're willing to apply and how much bandwidth you're willing to apply to it. Or like you say, let it fritter away. And hopefully just that'll be natural and better than constantly creating more battles. There's a friend I made, he's American. I met him at an airport, and I did a whole podcast with him, and he went through a divorce himself where his ex moved back to the US and he was stuck in Britain. And we talked about all of that, and now he's back in the US and he's with his kids, and he says his biggest issue is that his ex still treats him like he's married, as if they're still a couple, but they're not, and they're both dating other people, and they're trying to co-parent their kids, and they're still sorting out all the legal stuff. And I just know so many couples that are in that position where they're trying to cohabitate, co-parent, share bills, not share bills, pull things apart. And I just don't know what the template for success looks like anymore. So you've given some stats about the success rate of entrepreneurs, which is true. 99% of businesses don't make revenue. And of the ones that do, most aren't profitable. And of the ones that are profitable, there's a timeline. Then you look at marriage, and that has a rate of what it is. I think it's 50, 60, 70%, depending on what the definition is. What are the stats around post-divorce, co-parenting success, and what are the things to look for? And this is what I'm grappling with, and I'm sure most of your clients are as well, is how do you take the higher ground in all this? What have you observed? What have you learned? What's your advice?
Unfortunately, a lot of times people will say, well, you just need to be rational about this, right? You need to be logical about this instead of emotional about this. And I don't think that's helpful advice. I do think that helpful advice is saying, what is my value here rather than my emotional reaction, to have a value-driven response. How am I going to choose? So I'm going to start with a piece and then back up to another piece you said. So I think that people have control of only three things in their lives: their aspirations, their attitude, and their actions. Those three A's, and that's it. If you find yourself trying to control anything else, you're losing. So aspirations, what do I want to move towards? What's my goal? What's my hopes? What are my dreams? You don't have much control over your fears. They pop into your head. That's what a brain does for us. That's what we've inherited. So we got our aspirations. I can choose where I want to move towards. That doesn't mean I'm going to achieve it. And so if I have an aspiration for a business, I can have that aspiration. I can choose that, not whether it is successful or not. That there's some external pieces. Your attitude. Am I going to figure this out, or am I going to walk away? And I never want people to hear that as me saying you've always got to have a figure it out attitude, because there are times when you go, I got to walk away. A business is at failure and you don't have to keep pushing it. You finally go, we'll close it. I'm walking away from that. There are other projects. So we get to choose that. The last is our actions, what we say and what we don't say, what we do and we don't do. That's in our actions. And many times I've had people say, I can't help how I act. And so I've had this in my office. Somebody starts yelling at their spouse or calling them names. I'm like, hey, you know what? You need to choose to control that. Well, I can't. And my question is, okay, so let's fast forward. You're now in divorce court. You're in court. The judge is saying these same things. Are you going to yell? Absolutely not. Why? Well, because the judge is going to get me in trouble. Okay, then you're telling me you have control. You just don't want to admit that control, right? And so we often get wrapped into these emotional reactions, which are rarely about our values. So we have a value place that we can say, I'm going to choose to respond from this value. And you've named some values, of doing what's best for the kids, of not wanting to go after somebody personally, for instance. Those are value positions. I find it important to invest in these family relationships and making sure my kids, my in-laws, wherever, there's a connection there. That's value. So now let's back up again. That truth and reconciliation, there are two pieces of it, of being able to forgive and being able to say, I apologize. And that is what one person can choose on each of those. I can forgive somebody, whether they apologize or not, whether they ask for that or not. I can choose that. One of my books is about how to forgive, because a lot of people are waiting for something to happen and they don't want to forgive and let the other person off the hook. And there are the air quotes that you can't see since this is audio, but they want to hold someone accountable. And I'm like, you're holding yourself stuck on that. When you choose to forgive, it's so that you're no longer captive. When you choose to apologize, it's also so you're no longer captive. It's nice if that process is a two-way street, but it doesn't have to be. A person can say, I'm not going to get sucked into that anymore. I'm going to choose to let that go. And I'm going to choose to say, you know what? I was responsible for that and I apologize. And that is a one-sided piece. They're independent from the relationship.
It's interesting because I'll say two things on that. One of the biggest mistakes I made, which I'm more than happy to confess to anyone who will listen, was as a professional, I learned so many strategies and tactics in the boardroom, in getting investors to sign checks, in building operational scale, in taking a business from 1 to 0. And I sit here now with all of that knowledge in my head and all that experience, and I'm confident enough to run a consultancy around business transformation and growth architecture. But it wasn't always like that. But the mistake I made and the learning I made is I used to take all of that strategy and try to apply it to a family situation. I hear about police officers coming home and using police tactics against their kids, or psychological interrogation. And I just go, there's no decompression chamber, and when you come home, you don't just go in like a scuba diver and get rid of the bends for 5 minutes in a chamber before you then walk into a different reality where you have to quickly switch your mind to, okay, if I'm doing business, I'm pretty aggressive because things have to get done, deals have to be pushed over the line. But the minute I get home, I shouldn't be thinking that way. It's hard to switch those minds and go into a house where you got to wipe poo and get dinner done, and the things are cooked and the laundry's out, and you suddenly go, why isn't this project managed? Why isn't it handled? And that's, again, I will admit I made that mistake. But to be fair, it went two ways, and we both accused each other of treating each other like servants or employees. And again, that's she's not right and I'm not right, but I have to let all that go. The point I'm trying to make is all of the strategies that I learned and applied and were good at in the business world were alien to the domestic situation and to the marriage situation and relationship. But I changed and I learned to do that. And I did figure out a way to be softer and change and be present and all that stuff. Unfortunately, it seemed to have come too late. Because like you said, I hit pause on a few things thinking, cool, I'll come back to that. Oh, right, the mortgage got to pay. Okay, sorry, so in all of that, like you say, you're hitting different pause buttons on maybe a few businesses, on maybe a few ideas, on some aspirations, on some travel, on your kids. And then whatever kids you get, you can never plan for their personalities and neurodivergence in our case, or any of that type of stuff. All this to say that truth and reconciliation can take different forms. But I think what I will take from the business world, what I still take to the business world, what I'm going to carry forward is value propositioning. Any business I work with, they have to know what they stand for. They have to know what their core values are. Nike, just do it. Apple, we're not a computer company, we're a design company. You know the headlines. Any company that's sitting there, be it Rolex, Apple, Bentley, any company that's lasted 20, 30, 40 years, Coca-Cola, all these long Warren Buffett friendly businesses are there because they know what they value and they don't deviate. And I'm now looking at that, sitting on the other side of a divorce with kids and everything we've just discussed. And I'm thinking, what do I value? What's my value proposition? And you almost have to do that marketing exercise of writing down a brand proposition, but I have to apply. Now that applies to life. And now I look back and I go, right, these are my values. And like you say, if I'm going to play the long game, I have to stick to them because they're what I know. and they're what I can fall back on. And your example of the judge made me think of back in the police days. They said, whenever you're out there in the public doing public policing service, always imagine you have to explain everything you do to a judge. Why did you pursue that car in the rain? Why did you make that arrest? Why did you sweep that person's legs? Why did you draw your weapon? All of that stuff. You have to be able to stand in front of a judge and say, I feared for my life, and da-da-da-da-da. You have to be able to rationalize everything that comes out of your mouth, everything, all your actions. And nowadays it's worse because everything's being filmed and taken out of context. All of that to say that I think in all of this, there is that value proposition, but it keeps changing. I can be core to who I am. I can say I'm a great guy and I'm consistent and I'm loyal and those are true. And I have friendships that I haven't had to hit pause on or that I have unpaused, and suddenly they're better friendships than they were 10 years ago because there was a consistent value. So I think of everything you've said, that's sort of my takeaway. Then the other takeaway is values keep changing. And it seems in today's world, they change quick.
What I've noticed is there are some values that an individual chooses that will never change, might deepen. The shade of it might change, but let me say, there are bad values that people hold.
Yeah.
But for the good, strong values that people have, they generally don't change as a value. They may change in how you see it and how you pull that in. But someone who values loyalty probably is not going to one day say, you know what, I don't value that anymore. Someone who values being honest is probably not going to someday go, you know what, I think I'm just going to be a liar from now on. I'm going to change that. So it can deepen. And you may say, well, now that's more important. So if you're parenting a young child, your value may be guiding them. And as they hit adulthood, your value may be being more of a companion or a friend to them. But there's still a common piece of connection with them that you want to stay in connection with them that continues on. You're right. If you can't name your values, you're going to have a hard time choosing your actions, because if you're very transactional in your approach, then whatever suits that day is going to be what carries your action versus being a very value driven person. When I die, people are going to look back and say, you know what, he was this.
Yeah.
What would that be?
I remember reading somewhere, I can't remember where it was, but it says, imagine you could be a fly in the wall at your own funeral. Who would turn up? What would they say? Would they be saying that guy owes me money, or, you know, he funded something that changed my life? And I remember that lesson, learning that in university and going, yeah, actually, if, you know, what outcome do I want? Nowadays, I think in terms of values and I think in terms of outcomes. So whenever, like you say, I erupt and I don't go in, like my old police instinct kicks in. What if I was in front of a judge right now? What would I say? Right. And it wouldn't be get your ass on the ground. And, you know, it wouldn't say that. And I'm sort of joking, but I'm being serious. But then I suddenly go, I take a breath. I've learned this now. If I get aggravated, I stop and I take a breath. And in my head, I go, what outcome am I hoping for? And sometimes I say it aloud now. I say, and this has happened in business as well as in any time there's an argument, I just take a breath and I calm down and I go, what outcome are you hoping for? And I sometimes ask the other person the same. And then I fall back to, okay, I value this. I would like this outcome to happen. How can we make it happen? And I find it's a big diffuser. And God, I wish I'd done that 10 years ago. But now, you know, I've learned the lesson, and I hope anyone listening can learn the lesson is if you're getting into a marriage, if you're having kids, all of that stuff, just reflect on what your values are and kind of what outcomes you want. And you made a great point with your 3 A's. You know, you can have ambition and action and everything, but it may not go the way you want. But if you fall back to, you know what, it's what my father taught me. If you've tried everything you can, you've given it 100%, it didn't work, move on to the next thing, you know, knowing that you gave your best. If you didn't give your best, you're going to regret it because you'll keep doubting yourself and you'll carry that forward. So I think,
and that's, and you just named such an important piece there. It's easier to move on if you go, I gave it my best, than to live in regret. Right. And that's there's a bottom line for me of when I'm working with people going, let's get to the point where if it doesn't work, I can look in the mirror and go, I did my best. I don't have regrets over that. What drags people down, regardless of outcome, is the regret, living in that world of regret.
Yeah. Look, we've covered a lot. We've covered all three. We've covered entrepreneurial issues. We've covered marriage and divorce issues. And we finished on co-parenting and values. And I suppose just to wrap all this up, this conversation has sparked a number of things in the way I'm thinking about my way forward. I think you've inspired me to go a little bit deeper, as you say, on some of the things on value, on truth and reconciliation. But truth and reconciliation might just have to be done in my own head. I might not get the court. I might not get the judge. I might not get what Nelson Mandela gave to his people, which is a bit of closure between the warring factions. But I'm going to have to find inner peace, I suppose, on my own. And I think you've really guided me to some healthy places. And I suppose just to wrap up, would you like, shameless plug, but do you want to just tell us a bit more about what you've produced in your books? And by the way, I'm going to put all the links in the show notes below, so you don't have to shout out emails and handles. We'll put it all in the show notes. But what have you produced in your 25 years of coaching people like me?
I've written now 7 books, more than 7 books, but 7 books that are published right now. And then there's the Save the Marriage system that a lot of people have used. And I've got a new app. So let me just go through 2 of those. And
Sure.
There is the what if my marriage is in crisis, but I realize I haven't done what I could. That would be where you hit the Save the Marriage system. And that's savethemarriage.com. Pretty direct, savethemarriage.com. New, though, is the Unpause app, which came out in November. And the Unpause app is designed for couples who are like, yeah, we hit the pause button and no, we're not at the end. No one's threatening that. Let's get this going before we're at that point. And so that's unpauseyourmarriage.com. Unpauseyourmarriage.com gets you to the app piece. And that is just designed for it's a morning and evening plus some education pieces to help people change their systems, which is something that entrepreneurs naturally understand. You got to have your systems in place. And in a relationship that's not working, the systems haven't been working to support the systems as designed are working for exactly the results you're getting. And if those aren't what you want, we got to change the systems to more of what you would want. And so the Unpause app is designed for that.
Finally, do you feel that this 25 years of value, clearly you've been consistent in your value, you've been consistent in your approach, you've been consistent in the way you help, and all driven by some early realizations, but do you feel that you're making an impact? Do you feel that people are listening? Do you feel that people are aware now that there's steps to take, or do you think some people just go too far and they can't be helped by your websites and by your books?
Well, that's yes and yes. Absolutely. There are people who are not going to be helped by that. I hope that even there, they can find a way of being more healthily moving forward. So somebody said, oh, so you want to be famous? And I'm like, I would rather leave an impact than be famous because I'm not going to be here one day. That's not going to matter. Impacts we leave behind are what matter for future generations. Can we leave the world better than we found it? And that's all I'm looking for. That's
a hell of a legacy. And I think when your day comes, I think people will have a hell of a lot to say about you.
I hope so.
which is an aspiration I share. So look, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's my ambition aligns with yours. Worst case, this is going to be a time capsule for my kids and maybe some guidance. But in the best case, someone might be listening and it might change your life. And I think I'm excited by that prospect now, and certainly coming out of where I've been, my friend calls it the J curve. You slide all the way down, you hit the bottom, but you curve back up. And so I'm starting to feel like I'm looking up the slope now, and there's a climb ahead of me. Don't get me wrong, but it feels like things could be better. And if anything, Lee, you've compounded that feeling with this conversation. So appreciate you coming on. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To support SparkHub, please have a look at the show notes below this episode, or visit thesparkhub.com to sign up for our newsletter, which offers exclusive inside scoops. Just quickly, the music you're hearing is composed by Shi Hao Yan, and the audio engineering is done by Emily Chung. My name is Alan, and I hope that you dream big and something sparked in you today.